Hello and welcome to Thorgi's Picks. Yes, after many requests, we're bringing back the show where we spotlight random comics simply because I like them and I think more people need to know about them. However, before we talk about today's book, we need to start with something a bit sad. Last week, Georgia Congressional Representative John Lewis passed away at the age of 80. John Lewis was a real-life hero and last surviving member of the Big Six of the Civil Rights Movement. He was one of the leaders of the historical 1963 March on Washington, organized and participated in dozens of nonviolent protests for which he suffered multiple arrests, led the legendary march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, where he suffered such brutal beatings he almost didn't survive, and continued to fight for equality throughout his long lifetime, leading demonstrations for the LGBTQ community, and even just last month appearing at a Black Lives Matter protest, even though he had been battling cancer for months. He was truly a hero who few can stand next to. But among all of these achievements, one entry on his resume you might be shocked to see was comic book writer. Yes, in 1957, a comic about Martin Luther King Jr. called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story was released. And young John Lewis read this book and he described it as a roadmap of how to get involved in the civil rights movement. He thought this book had the power to tell the story of what was happening in the world in a way that would leave an impact on the readers. From this book, he saw the influential power of comics. In fact, he believed in the power of this format so much that in 2013, when he decided to write his autobiography, he decided to do it in a comic. And he released a 3-part graphic novel series called March, which, as you can guess, is the subject of today's video. Now, I'm going to make something clear right here at the start of the video. When you talk about a book all about the achievements and the struggles of a man like John Lewis, it's kind of hard to judge the book fairly because, did you hear me list off all of his accomplishments? I know a lot of people out there think if you praise a book written about a man who did all of that, then you're more praising the man behind the book rather than the quality of the book itself. And I want to go ahead and assure you right now, yeah, that's not what's happening here. I read through this book multiple times to try and judge it both in terms of what it was recounting, but also in terms of how well it was recounting it, how well it was constructed, how it used the format. And I can tell you, yeah, even if this was not a biography about important events in American history that you should read about, this would be a fantastic book that is well worth your time. I realized what an amazing book this was just from the opening pages. It starts with a hazy panel forming in the middle of a white void as an unseen speaker tries to get John's attention, clearly letting us know that this is an old memory forming in our author's mind, something that he's recounting at a time in which there were many thoughts going through his head at the exact same moment as someone tries to break through and get his attention, a thought to a day long past returning to him. You turn the page and you see a young John Lewis standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the site of the horrific Bloody Sunday conflict where John Lewis and his marchers were assaulted by police officers. The speaker, Hosea Williams, turns to John and asks if he can swim. John looks off the side of the bridge and says, "No." Hosea says, "Me neither, but we might have to," as the panel then turns to show the officers standing on the other side of the bridge. From there, you can see the police shouting them down, telling them to disperse. The words of the cops loud and bombastic and razor-sharp bubbles as the protesters stop and bow their heads to pray, fully knowing what is coming. And you can see in stark contrast to the bubbles of the police, the speech of the protesters is small, it's barely audible, letting you know just what our heroes are up against, how overpowered they are. From there, the police charge, and the panels go from well-established squares and rectangles to distorted angles, panels laying on top of each other even, completely capturing this feeling of chaos exploding on the scene as Lewis is targeted. An officer swings at him, the panel goes to black, and you turn the page to be greeted with the title, March. Such a huge explosion of text set atop the background of Washington, D.C. as the sun is rising, as if the words March are now breaking through the dark night of the previous page with a bright light of hope, the dawn of a new day. This is honestly one of the best starts to a book I have ever read, and I assure you, I am not exaggerating on that. The way the tension hits you immediately within just the first 2 pages, how it captures just how brutal this moment in history was, how it sets up that this is the end point of this story, and now it makes you invested to see how we got there, and also to see what happens next, what happened to the people on that bridge, only to then cut to the symbol of hope of the rising sun, so that way you know there is something good to be found on the other side of all this suffering. It's Quite simply genius how this is constructed and put together. And the amazing pacing and presentation of the series continues from there as we cut to Washington, D.C. on the morning of January 20th, 2009, as we follow Congressman Lewis as he wakes up and prepares to attend Barack Obama's inauguration. This is used as the framing device of the entire series, as it occasionally cuts back and forth between John Lewis thinking about the struggles he went through and the protests he led for equality, how hard he fought for the right for Black Americans to have the right to vote, and then we cut to Lewis attending the inauguration of the first Black president, showing just how far the world had come and letting the reader know that we reached this point only because of everything that he and his team did. When you see people suffering throughout the book, when you see them being beaten and being arrested, it will then remind you that it was all for something, that in the end, they did change the world. Now, I don't want to just give you a play-by-play of the entire book. I'm recommending this to everyone so that way you can go and read it for yourself after all. But I will say that throughout the first book, the pacing is exceptional. Not just in the opening or how it cuts back and forth between the past and present, but just in the way that it can set up a scene. Just in the way that it can build tension to really put you in the moment. Perhaps my favorite example of what I'm talking about is there comes a moment when Lewis is recounting his childhood, growing up in the South working on his family's farm. One day his uncle comes by to visit and his parents think it would be a good idea for his uncle to take him on a trip up north. The sequence of them making the trip is short, only about 5 pages, and yet they capture so much in that sequence. Seeing the stress in his uncle's eyes, seeing them have to check a map that shows what gas stations are safe to stop at, watching the glares of the people on the road, knowing what would happen if they were forced to stop. It was an incredibly tense 5 pages. When it got to the end and his uncle let out a sigh of relief as they crossed the state line, I felt myself actually let out a breath of air that I didn't even realize I had been holding in this entire time. And I keep mentioning Congressman Lewis because he was the author and this was based on his life, but I have to stop and mention the artist Nate Powell. I've been talking this whole time about how the art does a wonderful job of capturing every moment of the story. I already pointed out how well he's able to convey the more stressful moments, but even the day-to-day scenes leave an impact on you. There is a scene where early in Lewis's life, he's talking about how he wants to be a preacher, and you can see him reading a Bible, and the words he's reading are being carried on his back. So that way it really captures how heavy these lessons are to him, how much what he's reading is weighing on him. It's a fairly simple scene when you think about it. It's just a boy reading a book in that moment, but the way that the art is able to capture that moment really lets you know what an impact this had on Lewis's entire life. And of course, when Lewis gets old enough to start taking part in the protests and begin organizing them, it goes through all the stages of it, including how they treated each other not to fight back, how they prepared for what could be thrown at them. All things that you never really get to see in most stories about these protests. But it was a very educational side, and this book is able to use those scenes to ramp up the tension and make the readers concerned for what is to come. And when we get to those scenes, the actual moments of the protests themselves, everything works together like clockwork to really show you just how horrifying these moments were. The scenes where they sit at a diner counter, asking to be served, only for the staff to close up the counter and turn the lights off, leaving them all sitting there in eerie silence. Knowing this was the calm before the storm, it was genuinely chilling. You can feel your stomach sink as you know what horrible things are about to come. But again, I want to stress, this is not a book about the suffering that Lewis went through in his civil rights protest. It's a book about hope. It's a book about standing up to injustice. It's a book about not what John Lewis went through, but about the lessons he tried to teach. The lessons that there is such a thing as good trouble, and sometimes you need to get into it. And again, it's really shocking how well Congressman Lewis was able to use this format to tell his story. Granted, he did have some help as he had a co-writer in Andrew Aden, a man who literally wrote his graduate thesis on the Martin Luther King comic that I mentioned earlier, but this was his first book as well. So that almost makes it twice as impressive that these two knocked it out of the park like they did. Really, the only complaint, well, not complaint, more of a critique that I have of the book, is that the second book focuses a lot on the different protests and marches that Lewis organized, and he wanted to make sure that everyone involved got an introduction with some background on them, and for historical purposes, that's great and very important. But there's so many people that get introduced in that one book that it kind of slows down that excellent pacing that the previous book had. But really, that's about the only criticism that I have. In one of the 3 books, they could have introduced these people a little better. That's it. Aside from that, this is one of the best biographical comics I've ever read. Now, with the recent passing of Congressman Lewis, I feel like now was the time to spotlight these trades. If you've never read these books, then there's so many important stories to hear, a lot of important wisdom to learn, and there's a lot of motivation to be found in his lessons about getting into good trouble. So check these books out. Last I checked, I know the first trade was on sale on Comixology, so I'll put a link to where you can get that in the description down below. But if you prefer to read physical books, they are all collected into a great box set. If you happen to read these books, then let us know what you thought about them down below. And if you want to see more comic recommendations, like I said, we took a break, but Thorgi's Picks will be back with more spotlights. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Come back next time.